Hello. I just finished editing this interview or this talk with Jim Woodhouse. He's an emeritus professor at Cambridge University, and he's made a long and very interesting career in studying and researching how physics is used in musical instruments to make music. And it's an extremely interesting talk. I was really proud to be able to share this with you and hope you enjoyed it as well.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. You have a nice background, much better background than
well, that's why I hijacked my wife's computer. My background upstairs is not so good.
So yeah, thanks for doing this. Sorry I couldn't do it earlier. I teach class 9 to 10, so this was about the earliest I could do it on a regular day. So good afternoon to you.
It's as you say, mid-afternoon, and the sun is shining.
So I guess we can start with just tell me about yourself and your career.
How I got into this.
Yeah, we could do that too.
So I started out as an undergraduate. I was a mathematics student, but I've always been interested in woodwork, I suppose. And while I was still an undergraduate, I discovered that I could join an evening class in Cambridge and make a guitar. So during my final undergraduate year, I built a guitar. And then I was still here doing a master's year, so I skipped across and joined the companion violin making class. And so at the end of the master's year, and I was looking around for a PhD subject, and I had been thinking in terms of astrophysics, but I'd got interested in all this violin stuff. So I started inquiring around whether I could find someone prepared to supervise a PhD in the violin, which I did, and I've been on and off doing that ever since. So I did my PhD in postdoc studies on that. I've then worked in various sort of more industrial acoustics and vibration subjects. Then I got headhunted back into the university, into the engineering department, and spent the rest of my career there. I've been retired for a couple of years now, so I'm allowed to do anything I like these days.
So I didn't realize, I missed that you were in industry or in manufacturing instruments for a while.
It was a consultancy company getting called in for troubleshooting jobs of various kinds to do with sound and vibration.
Okay, and then academics pulled you back in.
Yeah, that's right.
So I kind of wish that happened. I went straight from PhD to academics, and I work with industry, but I think you miss something. So having that kind of practical connection, I think it's good. So you were building instruments first, and then
that's right,
got into this. So I assume you also played instruments.
Yeah, not very well, but between us,
sure, better than me.
The various things in the background all get played from time to time. They were all either made by us or made by people we know, I think. You get
mostly string instruments.
Strings are my thing. Yes, a little bit on percussion, but I don't play percussion. Our playing is all to do with strings. I mean, acoustical terms, I've done some stuff with percussion.
All right, so we're talking about strings and different kinds of instruments. What is a musical instrument? Do we have a good definition for that?
Well, my pragmatic take on that is that, because I'm glad you didn't ask me what is music.
I don't know if we'll get to that at all.
Nothing is gained by me trying to, you recognize it when you see it, hear it. So a musical instrument is some kind of contrivance which allows a human to turn muscle actions they can do with their hands, their lips, whatever, into sounds that they want to make. So everything stems from that, really. You need a device which can make sounds, which has a variety of sounds it can make, and that you can control them in interesting musical ways within the limits of human, number of fingers, reaction times, and so on. So that every musical instrument is some piece of ingenuity for allowing people to, say, turn their muscular skills into music. And almost by definition, music is a competitive business. The top performers are all, competing with each other for the next booking, apart from the fact they may actually enjoy doing it. And the only thing that distinguishes one player from another is rather subtle things, right at the limit of these human capabilities. There's a clear analogy with sporting equipment that tennis players at the top end of the game are all pretty good at playing tennis, and the differences hinge on tiny things. And if you believe that the equipment you're holding is better than or less good than what your opponent is holding, that may have an influence on whether you win the game or not, whether or not there really is a difference. And so people are prepared to pay money for tennis rackets or violins, which seem to them to be better. There's a competitive market, and all sorts of ingenuity is then devoted to developing them. So there's a very clear parallel, I think, except that the range of musical instruments is probably wider. There's such a lot of different things that people have done over the millennia. There have always been musical instruments. They're right back there in the archaeological record from amazingly far away. And it's still, there are patents coming out all the time for supposedly interesting new things. Nearly all of them you never get to hear of, but sometimes someone has a good idea. So it's that's a thing which in a way distinguishes, as an area of acoustics and vibration to study, the tone of musical acoustics is set by this fact that the customer, as it were, are these players or instrument makers. And always the thing they're interested in is tiny details. They don't want to know roughly how it works. They don't want to solve their noise problem and make it a few dBs quieter, which is where nearly all the funded research in acoustics lies. They say, we know roughly how it works, and we know how to do a pretty good job of making a violin or a guitar or whatever it may be. But my customers are complaining about this little detail. If I cut a bit more wood off here, or I change the shape of the bridge, or choose different strings, will I solve that problem? And how do I do that the best? So there's always this push towards details, which makes it scientifically a very satisfying subject, because in typical sort of noise consultancy work, you gain them a few dBs. You see some interesting stuff along the way, but they don't want to pay you to look any further into it. You've done the job by making it a little bit quieter, or letting them get in under the wire on some legislation that says what the maximum they can do. So it's a funny subject. You get to meet a lot of curious and interesting people, and they're always very demanding. And we never entirely answer the questions that they ask, because there's always another level of detail that they would really like to know.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things I was thinking about. There's a parallel with like working with industries. You work with industry, they don't always want to know the detail, the entire story. They just want to fix their problem or their concern. And the other thing I was thinking about, as I've heard stories about musicians, like rock musicians, their guitars, if it was painted with a certain color and they improve the sound. So maybe that's true, but yeah, you mentioned there's probably some kind of placebo effect or something.
Yeah, that's always part of it, and teasing those things apart is always one of the challenges. You shouldn't be too quick to dismiss people who are sure something makes a difference. but it does make sense to ask, are you sure? Can we test it? Can you still tell if you're blindfolded? That's one corner of the subject, the hardest corner of the subject really, is trying to do science on human perceptions, human abilities to discriminate. You have to do that before you even start to do any physics on thinking how instruments actually work.
Yeah, so your work is really permeated widely. That there's popular articles. When I was looking in your background at like news articles, like the one that comes to mind, there was one on Stradivarius, and then someone tested it like in a blind test versus a new violin, and you chimed in on that. So any
well, it was the famous study of that kind was done by an ex-student. She was a postdoc of mine, and then went on to do this old versus new violin study, which has got a lot of media attention. So yes, I'm also there on the edges of that one.
So, I mean, is a new instrument just as good as the old these artifacts?
That's a rather nuanced question, of course. Is every new violin better than a Stradivarius? No, of course not. What
Right.
that study showed was that so far as they could tell, and I'm sure they were very deliberately coy about both which particular old violins and which contemporary makers were represented, but they had a bunch of Stradivari and Guarneri violins and a bunch of carefully selected modern violins, a sequence of tests under different conditions, because people objected to the first one, so they did another one, trying to fix the problems. And the story is that the best contemporary violins hold their head up very well, and in one or two cases may win by a small head once there's a level playing field and players can't see what they're holding.
Yeah, I guess my question, a musician or professional musician, or maybe you could, how do you win that? How does what makes it better? That's
well, what makes it better? There's a question about how do you do the experiment to reach that conclusion, and then there's the question of what do you do next. I mean, presumably it's the makers of these instruments that are right up there with the great ones who then ask us the really difficult questions, because they're already thinking very hard about what they're doing, and they're making very subtle adjustments, and they want some guidance for that. And so the physical questions they raise are always very hard. Sometimes we can actually help. We can always help to focus the question differently, because a maker will tend to come in with different language and different experience. And there's always a bit of an exercise in sorting out your use of language so that you're at least talking about roughly the same thing. But it's then, well, the pressure for the scientist is to take this complicated subject and pull out something you can do. I mean, that's any science. How do you choose your next research topic? You want to be at the frontier, but it's no good raising a question that's so far beyond the frontier that you can't do anything. So you're always looking for the thing that's just over the edge, where you've got a chance of making some progress, but someone hasn't already done it. And from that point of view, the musical instruments are no different. So I listen carefully to what these makers say, and I try to pick out from that to say, well, that's very hard, that's very hard. Oh, now there's something I might be able to tell you. So it might be choosing wood, for example. What are you doing when you go to the wood yard to buy wood for your violins? Or if you want to make another instrument that's just like one that's been very successful, what is the definition of similar wood? Well, that's a nice physical question. We can employ a bit of technology to help with that. Whereas if they say, if I take a tiny shaving off here, will it sound better or not? That's a hard question. I may be able to say something about what will it do to the vibration and sound. Whether that's better or worse, that's where we have to collaborate and say, how can you pin down what you mean by better? What is the problem? Can we converge on a sort of shared understanding of what you might be talking about? And then I can suggest some things, but you've still got to go in and try it and get a player to try it, because it's not fundamentally a physics question that they're asking. It's a multi-science question involving all these different things. And that's
I guess, you're trying to, the easy thing is to replicate, or to the sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of, when you start talking about subjective, is this better than that? That's more, it depends on the person. So
to some extent, and the culture they grew up in, and all those things. Replicating is something that chimes, particularly with violin makers, more than most other instruments. There are several full-time professional violin making schools around the world. And what you mostly do if you're a student for 3 years or whatever in one of those schools is, in the first instance, you learn to make Strad copies. So the idea that, walking before you run, let's do your best to duplicate instruments that everyone agrees are good. Then maybe you can branch out and explore other things. But if you begin by making something that doesn't strike most people as a violin at all, then you're on a difficult grounds for starting a career.
yeah, this reminds me of probably my first introduction to anything in this area. I was helping to teach a class in senior design and engineering. So, one of the final classes, and they had different projects. And this project was, one group was working with Gibson guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And they were trying to modernize their manufacturing. I think everything was done by hand before then, and they had these people who worked there for a long time and had their techniques, and but then they started retiring, and they had difficulty replacing people. And so they tried introducing kind of automated manufacturing, and I guess I haven't went back there in a long time, but they had a difficulty replicating what the people did.
Yeah, and I think that's not unique to musical instruments, is it? I think if you go and talk to the guys in the design office at Boeing or whatever, they'll much the same thing. They'll still have designers who've been building airplanes for an awfully long time. And it's really hard with the whole knowledge capture business of sort of engineering design theory. How do you capture the knowledge of your experienced people on the ground and then turn that into either a way of teaching their successors or doing it a different way with some computer system or what have you? So as far as it goes, what you've described is that's not so different from some other industrial applications in manufacturing.
Yeah, and that's all, across all, I guess, humanity, this transferring knowledge and experience, I think, it's become kind of more of an issue, because we used to do more mentorships and more apprenticeships.
Yeah.
You'd work under someone. Maybe it's still that way in music, instrument manufacturing, somewhat.
To an extent it is. That's quite right. They most instrument makers will either go to a school where that is what they do, and most of the major industrial countries have a violin making school. Other instruments, guitar makers, are mostly, you don't go to a school for that. Probably you do an apprenticeship, more or less formal, working with someone who's already good at it. And then after a bit, you try to steal their clients, I suppose. They're all apprentice.
Yeah. I saw your son is in this business, right? I ran into.
Yes, he's a professional guitar maker.
Okay.
There are a couple of his instruments on the wall behind me.
Oh, wow. That's nice. So let's see where we're going to go. So I guess we can go back to something more, and this came up. So I've been doing these talks, and some things that, one of the reasons I found you is because some questions came up in previous talks I had with other people. One guy was a musician and he has a band, and you know, he was talking about, why do we have the Western scale and the, I guess, 440 hertz, you know, why do we pick these certain frequencies to build our music language on? You have any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, well, I can pontificate about anything. That's a feature of getting old. But why do we choose 440 hertz? No reason at all. It's just a convention. Why do we choose the intervals of music? That there's something which is built into how our brains are wired. Although then all kinds of sort of frills and excitement is built around that, but we do seem to recognize the harmonic series, essentially that. And no doubt that's because there are plenty of natural sounds, birdsong, for example, which is kind of proto-music. But there are lots of things, and especially the kind of things that might inspire you to want to make your own music, which are more or less periodic waveforms, which you can then vary in some way. The periodic waveform, as you know, can be turned into a Fourier series. So it has,
we want to talk about that at some point.
Yeah, many frequencies present, and they are either exactly or approximately arranged in this harmonic series, frequency ratios 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that seems to be wired into us. We've been, I suppose, listening and recognizing natural sounds for a lot longer than we've been human. So there's something there. And because those are the component frequencies of a single complex sound, you play two sounds together, do they blend? It probably helps if they match those frequencies. So you play two things where the fundamental frequencies are in the ratio 3/2 or 4/3. They chime in with the harmonic series, and there you are with the basis of a scale. That seems to be roughly, and then, the theory of that goes back to the Greeks. This is Pythagoras and his monochord and all of that. And there's a core of that which is uncontroversial. People do experiments on, getting people to, you hear a tone, now you hear a second tone with it, you turn this knob until they're nicely in tune.
Yeah.
And people do choose things that are more or less harmonic series. There are always subtleties. We may not do it exactly, and it may depend which culture you've come from. The thing which has happened in relatively recent times, given that we were talking about evolution, is the development of keyboard instruments. Now, if you've got fixed pitch instruments with a finite number of tones filling the octave, the octave is the least controversial thing. A factor of 2 is good. How do you subdivide the octave to make notes? Well, there are these certain things. You want the ratio of 3/2. You want the ratio of 4/3. There are a few simple whole number ratios that you want to have in there. And then there's a famous arithmetical problem, which again, I think goes back a long way. Maybe the Greeks knew this, which is that you take those two simple intervals. The octave is a factor of 2, and the fifth, the musical fifth, is a factor of 3/2. Well, if you go up a number of octaves and then come back down in fifths, you don't quite reach the same place you started. The arithmetic doesn't work. So 2 to the power something is never exactly the same as 3/2 to the power something, which means that any fixed pitch instrument like a piano or the frets on a guitar, you have to make a compromise. You can't have all those intervals exactly right. There are many different kinds of compromise called tempering systems in the jargon. The one we're most familiar with these days is something called equal temperament, which is simply where you say, I'm going to divide the octave into some number of equal intervals, some ratio and then I just do this, each note to the next is the same ratio. What's the smallest number I can use that gives me a decent approximation to these 3/2 and so on that I would like to have? And the answer to that question is the smallest number is 12. So that's why you have 12 frets in the octave on your guitar.
Well, that's interesting. Okay.
12 notes on the piano. The white keys and the black keys are no different from an acoustical point of view. So that's this idea of equal temperament. The virtue of it from a musical perspective is that it doesn't commit you to playing in one key or another. That all the intervals are the same, so you can change key in your music. The downside is that some of those intervals are represented fairly exactly, but some of them aren't. The famous one is the major third, 4 semitones, and it's out by a big enough interval that most people can hear it quite clearly. So is that good enough or not? Depends what you're playing, depends on the style of the music, and then you're off into the whole sort of complicated jungle of things. But it's the difference between, if you go to a piano recital, you don't expect to see the piano tuner in the interval. You go to a harpsichord recital, and there may be someone on stage in the interval tuning it. And one reason for that is that for technical reasons, you hear the pitch of a harpsichord note more precisely than a piano note. That's to do with physics. You'll ask me why in a minute, if you like. And so the piano can tolerate using equal temperament because the sense of pitch is fuzzy enough that most of the time we're not too bothered about it. There are other things wrong with a perfect harmonic series. The harpsichord is closer to the perfect harmonic series, lots and lots of overtones in the sound. And so if you change key, it will really sound wrong. So they won't tune typically in equal temperament. They'll have some better compromise for playing in one particular key. But if they want to play after the interval pieces in a different key, then they may be up there retuning it in a subtle way. So that's very typical of these musical questions. You ask a simple question,
Yeah.
you get a complicated answer, which still ends by saying, and that's just the beginning. You're
Yeah.
often.
I mean, I think everything's like that. You can go as deep as you want. But so I guess, your book is, I was reading through it. I haven't read all of it, but you go through some of the mathematics and the physics, and this, I guess, what you're just talking about relates to natural frequencies, which I don't think, if you're not an engineer or a scientist, you might not have heard of. Right, the harmonics and the natural frequencies, and that relates, right?
Yeah, every object that makes a noise when you hit it, the sound you hear is a mixture of frequencies, and those frequencies are characteristic of that particular object. Nearly everything makes frequencies that are not harmonically related. That's why nearly everything doesn't make a good tuned percussion instrument. You think of children hitting saucepan lids, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The stretched string is the exception. Right by itself, without any clever engineering, any stretched string produces something that's a good first approximation to a harmonic series. So you always get a fairly musical note by plucking a string. Play it with a bow, that's a different question, but that takes you off into another.
So it's easier to make a strings.
That's right. That's why so many instruments are based on strings. Yeah. The only other simple system which does the same thing is air resonances in either a straight or a conical tube, and of course that's the basis of all your woodwind instruments. So yes, a large proportion of the musical instruments, the melodic instruments around the world, are based on the rather small number of physical systems that naturally produce close enough to harmonics in their natural frequencies. If you're trying to make a tuned percussion instrument, then you have to do something clever. There's all kinds of interesting vibration engineering involved in making.
Because then you're talking about more of a membrane, right, than a one-dimensional
drum. It could be wooden bars in a xylophone. It could be the top of an old oil drum in the Caribbean steel pan. But always with those things, you're fighting against nature. So the instrument maker has done something clever. rather than just taking what they were given. So you don't have to do anything clever to stretch a string, it just works.
That's very interesting. I've never thought about that. Uh, so you were talking about the piano. So the piano is a little bit, what the right word is, fuzzier, you said?
Fuzzier, yeah, and the reason for that, it goes back to this percussion instrument thing. So if you've got a metal bar in your hand and you hit it and it makes a clang noise, what note did it play? That's not a good question to ask because you don't get a clear sense of pitch. So that kind of bending bar makes a bunch of frequencies that are not harmonically related. Now, if you take, you think what's inside your piano wire is not what you would ordinarily call string at all. They're steel strings, maybe a millimeter in diameter. And that means in terms of the physics, they are under a lot of tension. And if they weren't so fat and made of steel, they would be nicely harmonic. But there's an element of this bending bar behavior in there as well. So it kind of tries to produce harmonics because of the tension effect, but they get messed around by adding in a bit of this bending bar percussive effect. So technically it's the bending stiffness of the string perturbs all the frequencies. Although they're in musical terms, each interval is a little bit sharp of what you expected. The intervals are all a bit wider than the harmonic series. You play them all at once, and it's not so obvious exactly what the pitch is, because your brain is making a compromise between this not quite harmonic series. And that's good or bad, depending what you want to do. Right. It contributes to the sound quality. And so if you just think of the difference between a modern piano and a harpsichord note, the harpsichord is much more twangy and actually much more precise in the pitch, for better or for worse, depending how good the tuner was. The piano has this more kind of rounded sound, and it's not quite so precise. And so from the point of view of tuning an equal temperament, that lets you get away with something that you can't get away with on other instruments. It's also part of the story of making the instruments louder over time. If you want a stringed instrument you can play in Carnegie Hall, then you've got to make a lot of noise if you don't want to use amplification. So the whole evolution from, so classical guitarists always have a problem in large venues if they don't use amplification. Right. Pianists generally don't. The modern piano has gone for really heavy strings, so there's lots of energy. So you need a machine to put the energy in. You don't pluck them with your fingernails. You need all those levers and hammers to hit it. But it's a fat string and lots of tension, so you can put lots of energy into it, and then you can extract more energy out into the soundboard and make sound from it. So you have the potential to make it louder. The process of doing that has led to heavier and heavier strings. That's part of how you achieve that. And this sort of fuzzier sense of pitch was probably a side effect, but there was a kind of co-evolution of the instruments and the style of music and the wish of composers, either whether composers wanted to have more musical modulation or whether they heard this sound and found they could get away with something. I mean, that's one of those chicken and egg questions, but the evolving for loudness and for and what that meant for the performer, what that meant for the sound, and what that meant for the composer, all of those things have come along in parallel to take us away from that sort of 17th century keyboard music written for the harpsichord and typical, I mean, especially that sort of high romantic 19th century piano music that absolutely relies on you having this modern instrument with this slightly fuzzy pitch so that you can modulate into any key, and none of them is any worse than the others. None of it is perfect, but you have the freedom to do musical adventures.
Yeah, so I think it's a good point. I have to ask you about the friction and the violin, because that's my area, tribology. So if I didn't ask you that, people get mad at me probably. But because we use this as a I don't know if you knew this, but you know, tribologists, that's what we call ourselves, and no one knows what it means. We're always trying to justify or tell people how important tribology is, friction and wear, and that it's everywhere. And so one of the popular stories is, you know, to make music with a violin, you have to have the friction between the bow string and the strings of the violin, and the rosin on there has to be just right so you get the stick slip.
That's right. All of that is true. And indeed,
you mentioned something before about difference between the violin, I think it was, and the guitar or other strings.
Yeah, I'm sure I pick one up. Hang on. Let's have an instrument in my hand. So it's a viola. It happens to be the thing I picked up first. So if I pluck one of the strings, it's a musical note. It doesn't matter what I do with plucking the string, different places, different ways of plucking it. You can't do anything too drastically wrong. Whereas as soon as I bow it, and I'm not a bowed string player, I might get a reasonably acceptable note. But you might get the kind of thing that parents are used to.
Yeah.
Now, that, from a science perspective, that tells you straight away that there's something nonlinear going on. You can't, linear systems only do simple things. And the plucked string is essentially linear. It's a technical term meaning easy, basically. As soon as you get into this frictionally driven thing, all kinds of different things.
It has to do with how you're exciting it, right? Or how the excitation.
It tells you all kinds of things. Like it tells you it's both the upside and the downside of the bowed string instruments. It's capable of a much richer repertoire of sounds, but the price of that is that it's much harder to control to get the one you wanted. So that's why you have to do this 5 hours a day of practicing if you're going to be a virtuoso, because it is possible to coax a much wider musical range out of a violin or viola, cello, than a guitarist has access to. And that's good, except that it can also be bad, because if you're not good enough at it, then all you get is the horrible sounds. So that sort of richness, and it illustrates the thing I said at the beginning, that you're always treading this line, that you want to have a device which is capable of making an interesting range of sounds you can use for music, but it's got to be humanly possible to control it. If it gets too twitchy, then nobody can play it. And that's the line that's being trod. So yes, friction and rosin is what's going on there. And from a research perspective, it's the bit we understand least. I can do your pretty good computer version of a plucked string. I could measure the properties of this string, this viola body. I could synthesize something in the computer that would be pretty similar. We still can't do a fully realistic simulation of a bowed string. We can get aspects of it just right, but music, a lot of it is about transience, the little details of how you start the note. And there are all kinds of important questions for musicians to do with whether one instrument is easier to play than another one, which may be to do with whether it starts well, whether it's easy to get the sound you want with a nice crisp transient, or whether it tends to scratch a little bit or whistle a little bit or do one of those bad things. For that, you need a model, not only of the vibrating string and the vibrating instrument body, but also of the rosin on the bow. So rosin, people don't know what that is. It's essentially the sticky stuff that comes out of trees. So it's a natural material. Speaking to a tribologist, as you will know, I was saying earlier that musical acoustics is different from most noise and vibration because the aim is the opposite. You want to make sound, not stop it. That's equally true with tribology. Tribologists mostly design lubricants to
Yeah, a
minimize,
large portion do, yeah.
whereas rosin is a friction enhancer.
Yeah.
It's been known since whenever. I'm sure people just found that you got this stuff that comes out of trees onto your fingers, and then you could squeak things and make noises with them, and gradually that has evolved into bowed strings. But there are other friction-driven things, and usually you use rosin. It gives you this strong. Well, I don't know how technical you want to get here, but it makes it's more likely to excite vibration, because there can be a big difference between sticking friction and sliding friction.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if we want to. I mean, there's the stick slip. Yeah, basically that they get stuck and then slides, stuck and slides. Right.
That's right. That's right. And
so it's some kind of balance. So
it is, and it's a rather curious balance. That the actual when your violin string makes the noise you're wanting to make, the string is doing something really extraordinary, which was actually first discovered by Helmholtz back in the 1870s with an extraordinary experiment, because that was the days before electronics, before electricity, really. So with a purely mechanical observations, with a mirror attached to a tuning fork, he managed to kind of strobe the string and find out how the string was moving. And really, so it's called Helmholtz's motion, because he got it right, essentially. But there are layers of details, but he got the basic motion correct. And the string is moving in a way that you would never guess. If you haven't seen these, you can see, yeah, there are animations online.
We can always, yes, point people to that later. Yeah.
But it's, it's essentially, I've already pointed out how the bowed string can do all kinds of horrible things. And you want it to play essentially the same note that you get when you pluck it. So Helmholtz's motion of a bowed string is a particular motion which on an ideal textbook string, the kind we teach to undergraduates, would be a possible free motion of the string, except that the actual free motion would gradually lose energy. And what the bow has to do is put just enough energy back in to keep it going without interfering too much. So really the regular Helmholtz motion of a bowed string is almost a free motion of the string, which happens to be able to tolerate the bow being there without being interfered with too much. Just this rather subtle injection of energy in each cycle to keep it going. But if you interfere too much with the bow, that's when you get one of those horrible crunch noises. So if you take over and you force it by pressing too hard, typically, then you lose that nice musical note, and you can get all manner of other things, but mostly they're things your violin teacher tells you off for. So the regular motion of a bowed string is a rather very subtle interplay between something the string almost wanted to be doing all by itself, and which it has this sort of sharp corner in the shape. There's a kind of triangle shape with a corner that shuttles around. And each time that corner passes by your bow, it triggers a transition between sticking and slipping.
Yeah.
The timekeeping comes from the string vibration, and then the rosin allows you to feed that energy in, provided the player is doing roughly the right thing with their bow, which is where then that science comes in.
So indeed, it sounds like the friction's important, but also, you know, the player, the force they apply, and the
that's certainly true. But also characteristic of this subject. So you're a tribologist, even if you were doing it in an application where you use rosin as a friction enhancer, people use it in making paper and things like that. But all you'd want to know is how big is the coefficient of friction. What you want to know in the violin string is what exactly does the transient look like? So dynamic friction on a time scale of milliseconds and maybe shorter than that. And that's where we still don't know the correct physics. I could give you some speculations about what appears to be going on, but
you know, it's hard to,
yeah,
it's hard to get funding or enough interest in these kind of things to, in tribology in general, it's hard to get research support, but
yeah, I know that, and where there is, yes, it's hard to get. Musical acoustics never has any funding. That's a general law of nature.
But there is some. I don't know if you have interest in this at all, but people have found this kind of more. There's this thing called AFM, atomic force microscope.
Yeah. I should say that you almost certainly know about Ken Johnson, contact mechanics book. Yeah, well, he's the one who recruited me into engineering. He was the hero of the AFM when it was first invented.
Yeah. Some people have done measurements and they found stick slip on very small scales. And I think it has something to do with atomic roughness and, atoms and.
There are things like that. Yeah, I've co-authored a paper with Ken Johnson on sticks.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. It's on the list somewhere.
I'll look that up. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's as you say, it's something which is. But you wouldn't put rosin in your AFM. People hate you with any kind of tribology measuring equipment if you put rosin in it because it's so difficult to get rid of. It's really sticky stuff. We have done some shear viscosity versus temperature measurements, but the lab cursed us for it because it took them ages to clean the machine out afterwards.
I mean, it's strange stuff, but if you had the right kind of ears, then you could AFM could be an instrument if you were picking up those frequencies.
Yeah, it could contribute something, although I don't think the friction of rosin depends on the atomic scale. I think it's driven by temperature. If you ask what's so special about rosin, why do we use it? So rosin is a glassy material, and lots of polymers and so on are glassy materials, and all glassy materials have something called the glass transition temperature, whereas as you heat them up, they go from being solid to liquid, but they don't have a melting point. They have a range in between where they melt gradually. Well, rosin is a glass with a transition temperature that's only a little bit above room temperature.
Interesting, yeah.
So that means that you raise the temperature by 10 or 20 degrees, and you're in this region where the viscosity or the shear modulus, depending how you look at it, is varying very rapidly with temperature.
How thick it is for people
to in your contact by your friction. So the mechanism of bowing a string is probably a thermal cycle. My best guess is that in every cycle of your vibration at 440 hertz or what have you, you raise the temperature in a very thin layer of the rosin by maybe 20 degrees.
Right. I think that's entirely possible.
Velocity down by an order of magnitude, and then it resticks, and diffusion carries that heat away, and it goes. So it's kind of going liquid and solid every single cycle with, say, something of the order of a 20-degree temperature fluctuation, probably in an active layer that's only maybe 100 nanometers thick.
Wow.
So, but it's bigger than atoms, but it's hard to see in an infrared microscope or anything like that.
That's very interesting. So before I also wanted to mention the 4A series, and you were talking about, and this kind of something I want to talk about. I think it's in the academic world, people tend to characterize things and look for. We got to start with something we know and something more simple. And so they try to characterize music with the 4A series, which you're neglecting. With that, you're just looking at how to word it. Amplitude, so the magnitude, how large it is, and then the frequency, right? So
yeah, I mean it's an important tool for your analysis, but it illuminates aspects of things, but only aspects of them. It's certainly, if you're only interested in steady sounds, the kind of thing you could make with an electronic oscillator, then the Fourier series is the whole story. Amplitudes, phases, we don't hear very much anyway. But music is not based on steady sounds. All the excitement of music is to do with things changing. And stuff is changing. The more interesting the music, the more things are changing all the time. Starting and ending transients of every note, vibrato, or ornamentation, all the things that players on any kind of instrument do. And those changes you don't necessarily capture in an illuminating way by just looking at the Fourier series or the FFT.
Right. I was going to try to tie this in, and I don't know where this, if it might not go anywhere. So I do stuff with rough surfaces or any kind of roughness, and there's a large movement to use fractals.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, we should have said this before, but the Fourier series is looking at a spectrum. People might understand that. And a fractal, this fractal idea, I think, has gone into the public mind, I think, because there's songs that mention fractals. But they assume that the rough surface follows this fractal mathematics, which is basically, it's a perfect, it's kind of like the harmonic idea that it's following the sequence perfectly. And I don't think it does. I don't think any surface does. But I think most people agree, but the question is, can you really model it that way? And then, I don't know, has anybody kind of translated any of these fractal ideas to sounds or music? And
people have tried, of course. I'm not a computer processing expert, but certainly the image compression, JPEG, is based on fractal representations.
Huh.
I don't know whether MP3 is. The compression of music is based on FFT segments and doing something with it. There may be some ideas of fractals inside that, but they will be of a limited, any practical application never needs to follow the pattern all the way down to infinity. You just need a range of scales over which you get a reasonable approximation by using the fractal structure. And then I think quite a lot of things, people who look at the structure of soil and gauge up sizes of particles, and there's up to a point that it may follow a fractal law, but of course you end up with molecules and then things stop getting smaller.
Right.
But over the sort of range in the middle, so it can have good predictive power for certain kinds of problems, but it doesn't have that sort of total mathematical elegance of the kind the Greeks might have liked.
Yeah, I think that's why we tend to get stuck on these things in a way, is because people want these beautiful, perfect mathematics to work. And maybe it does sometimes, but I don't know if it does all the time.
Yeah, no, it's always part of the story, but it's never the whole story. I think that's...
going along with that, you mentioned, I think, in the book, like deep theory and theories, and how I think this gets lost a lot because we talk about theories a lot. How good a theory is, or how, and I don't know, I was going to ask you, have you ever, as an academic in musical research, had to overcome resistance to certain, deep theories or truths that were well accepted, and having to like change people's minds about things?
Well, yeah, in a way, definitely, because I put those comments in there specifically aimed at certain colleagues that I won't name here. But there's a certain type of experimental scientist who often believes that measurements are everything. And if their measurements, and if your theory doesn't agree with their measurements, you must be wrong because the measurements must be right. But that's another of those things which is more nuanced than that. It all depends what you've measured, because measurements have to be interpreted just as theory has to be interpreted. And so there are certain things that we really, really expect to be true, Newton's laws of motion, that kind of thing. And if someone says they've done a measurement and it doesn't agree with those, well, if they're right, they're in line for the Nobel Prize. But it's much more likely that there's something subtle actually wrong in the measurement or wrong in the way they've interpreted it. And you actually need an interplay with the theory. And yes, there are always aspects of theory which are speculative and developing. That's what research is all about. But there are certain things, and in this particular area, it's the thing we talked about earlier. It's this idea of modes and natural frequencies and resonances of structures. The fact that for small vibration, small amplitude vibration, and music is nearly always in that regime, that any percussion instrument, say, the sound always consists of a mixture of particular frequencies which are characteristic of that lump of metal or wood or whatever it may be. And people who do measurements sometimes say, oh no, that's just mathematics, that's a simplification. We don't see proper modes when we do our measurements. And you then have to sort of tease them round to say, tell me exactly what you've measured and why you think it's saying this. And let's think a little more carefully about this, because if you have an experimentalist cast of mind, you may just be intrinsically skeptical. You just know that measurements, that they're measuring ground truth, and all that airy-fairy mathematical stuff is all made up. Well, some of it is, and some of it is a bit better than just made up.
Have you, this is going on a tangent as well. There's a famous book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yes, I read it when I was a student, yes.
And he has this idea of quality, and it kind of seems like it ties to the idea of, what makes a good instrument. We kind of know, but it's this it's this other parameter that we just kind of know. We just feel it.
Yes, and it's always an interplay. The harder you probe, the more you may be able to finesse aspects of it. But it comes down to human perceptions and judgments in the end. And we don't know how that works. We don't know exactly what your brain is doing and what it is you've learned to hear. Everyone hears things differently or sees things differently because you've learned different things. It's really hard to quantify that. It's certainly really hard to quantify it for one particular person. You could always do an experiment to try to find out how they perceive a particular thing. But talking about the audience in a concert hall, what are they hearing? What do they prefer? Well, the answer to that question is that what they want to hear is a good player. The instrument is incidental. They may say, I love the sound of your violin, but actually the ego of all performers is roughly correct on this one. What they want to hear is a good violin sound played well.
Right.
The player cares about whether the instrument makes it easier or harder for them to give that sparkling performance that the audience want to hear. But audiences are much better at distinguishing violinists than they are at distinguishing violins. And you have to do a very careful experiment to find out whether people can actually tell instruments apart, whereas they can recognize performers quite often.
Right.
Characteristic things, about that is the reason you buy their particular recordings and so on. So there's always a subtle interplay, and that's frustrating, but also what makes the subject interesting.
That's interesting you said that, because the last person I talked to was she's a mathematics professor at Cooper Union in New York, and she was Millie Shaw, and she was using robots to play instruments. And so one thing I was going to ask you, can a robot ever play? I guess I don't know if it's as good, or maybe it's the same. Because there's one of the things I was wondering. A human has a control system. We're getting feedback, listening, and then adjusting constantly.
I think you could make a robot marimba player no trouble. You could track a real player, time exactly when they hit, exactly how hard they hit. You could replay that with something that hit the bars. A robot violinist, it's possible in principle, and people are doing things like that. You can do motion capture on a real player, on a real instrument. You can capture all sorts of things that they're doing. And, a good enough robot that can reproduce all the parameters on the same violin it'll be pretty good. There's no reason in principle why you couldn't replicate that. What would be really hard to do with a robot is to give it a different piece of music and expect it to do a good performance on something else. What are the nuances? I mean, typically the word people use of performers that aren't all that good is that they're rather robotic.
That's right. It's funny.
And I mean, it's predictable. It's lacking whatever subtleties. You know, we don't want too much subtleties, but we need some, whatever that means. And that's the hard thing to code. So it's not so much the finger action and the driving the bow and so on. You could duplicate all of that probably more accurately than any human could do. But interpreting the music, listening to the other players in your string quartet and responding to them and doing something that blends, that raises all kinds of technical questions now, which I know nothing about. I'm sure there are people out there that are doing research on how musicians do that, and maybe with enough, you know, brain scanner stuff and so on, we might learn. But I'm sure we'll learn to get better at it.
I agree. And that kind of ties into everything we're doing with AI now, just driving. You know, there's so many people it's all these tasks seem simple when they at first, but then it gets very complicated because of all the input, and then also just kind of intuition and
ability to respond to novelty.
Yeah.
What you do when something goes wrong that wasn't in your training set, that's the sort of thing which makes you worry about being in an autonomous car, I think.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, back in my childhood, it was always said that computers were beginning to try to play chess, but they'll never do better than a human at playing Go. Well, that's no longer true.
Yep.
The world champions in both chess and Go have been beaten by computers. Now, those are more mechanical and algorithmic things than music, but I wouldn't say
a rigid set of rules in a way.
Yeah.
How long did you want to talk for? We've been going for an hour, so.
An hour, yeah. It's up to you up to a point, but
yeah. I mean, there's only a few other things that one thing I found remarkable was somewhere you talked about shock waves and they occur inside brass instruments. And
yes, that's that. Think of a trombone player or a trumpeter. And as they blow harder, it doesn't just get louder, the sound quality changes. It gets more brassy. They often use the word brassier. And that's when the pressure gets to a certain point, the tube is long enough that it forms a shock wave, a sonic boom inside the tube. And musicians, instrument makers, and then musicians have learned to take advantage of that, to use that sound to enhance the range of musical expression.
That's interesting.
I always claim that any interesting bit of sound or vibration theory I can find a musical application of somewhere. I haven't failed yet as far as I can remember. Maybe I've blotted it out of the memory, but no, those sorts of things, usually someone has found a way of harnessing it to do music.
So there's one other thing I was going to ask you about, but is there anything else you wanted, any points you want to make, or, you know, that we haven't?
You've covered the ground pretty well here. I mean, I could go on forever and you won't want to. So you ask me your...
So there's a quote I read, I think it's a few years old, but I saw it again recently. And it's, hopefully I get his name right. Michio Kaku, he's a physicist, okay? And he's famous for the string theory.
Okay.
And he has this quote, and I'll just read it. Strings can interact by splitting and rejoining, thus creating the interactions we see among electrons and protons and atoms. In this way, through string theory, we can reproduce all the laws of atomic and nuclear physics. The melodies that can be written on strings correspond to the laws of chemistry. The universe can now be viewed as a vast symphony of strings. So any thoughts? That's a very interesting quote.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of rhetoric you send to fundraisers, isn't it?
Right.
the precise connection of what they call strings and what I call a string is a rather subtle thing.
But, you know, everything in a way, everything is vibrations.
Yes, well, yeah. I mean, in science speak, everything is eigenfunctions and eigenvalues. That's really what it all comes down to. So all these natural frequencies, resonance we were talking about, that was the context where people first learned about that idea of eigenvalues and eigenfunctions. The whole of quantum mechanics, whether it's string theory or the older quantum mechanics, is based on the same kind of idea that anything you can observe is an eigenvalue of some operator or other. So from that point of view, there are very strong links from solid state physics, for example, into vibration problems. That's I've had some involvement in things there. The musical saw, you know, that thing you make a wailing noise with by bending a saw and playing it with a violin bow. That turns out to have the same the simplest model of that has the same mathematics as the first problem you learn in an undergraduate quantum mechanics course, which is the quantum mechanical harmonic oscillator. It's just exactly the same physics. Well, not the same physics, exactly the same mathematics.
You're right.
But it was done first in a musical saw. There's always a musical example of everything.
So thank you for doing this. You know, it was very interesting. I learned a lot. And, you know, also, if you have any other suggestions from other people I could talk to, because the whole idea of this was I was trying to, and it's kind of gone to a music tangent, but anytime looking at, you know, where science and art meet and looking at that interface in between.
Look up my colleague, Alan McRobie. Alan with a double L and then McRobie, McRobie.
Okay.
You'll find him. He's written a book about essentially using catastrophe theory to understand visual art and drawings. And he's an engaging speaker, and he might be an interesting person. You'd want to arrange to do some screen sharing to have graphics when but he's but look him up or find his book.
Okay.
The Seduction of Curves, his book.
Seduction of Curves.
It's an interesting.
It's a great title.
yeah, it is. He's that captures his. He's the first thing that comes to mind for that kind of thing.
And so you have a book, right? Or you're working on a book in process.
There's a sort of ebook which it's growing. I'm up to chapter 7 these days, so it's coming.
Do you have so when you're done and it's all an ebook online, do you plan to publish it, or is it just going to be free?
I'm enjoying the online format. The fact that I can have sound clips and animations and unlimited color pictures. Why would I want to throw it away to go back to something that sits on a shelf?
Right.
No, I will have to make sure that it doesn't disappear when I stop paying the web hosting subscription. So I will want to transfer it to the university to host it, probably to keep it going. But that's the only thing one slightly worries about. Paper books on shelves, for better or for worse, can
for
last
a while at least.
Electronic things can disappear, but it's a very versatile and flexible formula. And I'm enjoying doing it this way, and it's unlimited. I don't have to reach that point of saying, okay, it's finished. Now I'll send it to the publisher. It just, as far as I've got, is out there. I get feedback from people and suggestions, and I get in there and I edit them and correct things and add little extra bits. I do something else that I think is interesting, and I can go back and add another section in somewhere. So it's growing in a
very organic.
An organic sort of way. And now I think it's the future of the book, this kind of thing.
I've really enjoyed listening to that you can put sounds in there, like you said, and that really helps explaining.
Yeah, for some kinds of things. Well, and animations, they sometimes one animation tells you something that no amount of words or still pictures really conveys. Some complicated 3D shape, just rotating it slowly, and suddenly you can see what it's really supposed to be.
Well, that's all I have, and I really appreciate you talking to me.
Good. That's been interesting. Okay.
Take
Good.
care. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Bye.